This is Gary from Vigilant Software. Some of you may know me as part of the support team. Others of you are either new to looking to purchase the tool or wanting to get to grips as a new user of the data flow mapping tool. So the screens that we're going to be going through to start off with is going to be a simple introduction to the data flow mapping tool from a starting point, what it will include, some of the new features that we've brought into the platform over the past couple of weeks, couple of months, which is essentially the consultancy access, which should have been sent out through some marketing emails to you all, as well as some other areas such as information points for data protection officers, contact details, and also representatives within your organization as well. So to start off with, we're just going to run through a couple of slides just to introduce you to Vigilant Software and the data flow mapping tool. So the purpose for today's meeting is it's part training webinar just to go into a bit more depth than what we typically would do on a sales demonstration, and also obviously to tie in part of the sales process as well for anybody that is new to the platform as well. So in today's discussion, we're going to go through an introduction to the data flow mapping tool, cyber comply, and Vigilant Software. We're then going to go through accessing the tool via the browser. We're then going to cover off user management. This will encompass the new part of the system, which is the consultancy access, and we'll explain in a bit more detail how that will work. We're then going to go through a process mapping exercise, where we'll essentially be running through one that we have pre-created. It is one that is used quite regularly on the sales demonstrations, but we'll go into it in a bit more detail, show you how you actually utilize the assets within the map and how you create those links as well. We'll then finish on the final outcome, which is ultimately the report, and then we'll finalize the entire meeting with a Q&A, and that typically is about 10 minutes at the end of the meeting. With regards to time frames, we are ideally trying to keep this within the 90 minutes that we advertise. We just give the first 10 minutes to ensure everybody gets on and can obviously hear and see us successfully from their side as well. So just to make you aware, the endpoint for today's meeting is likely to be 4:30, maybe veering towards 4:45, depending on the level of questions we receive from you all. So an introduction to the data flow mapping tool. Just to explain the definition, it's essentially a diagram of how personal data flows through a given process and is transferred from asset to asset within a business. Now, assets can be things from basic pieces such as maybe a person, maybe a front desk, all the way through to server management systems as well. The tool that we're going to be showing you today was essentially designed to simplify that process, move you away from things like Visio, which won't give you the full in-depth lawful basis reasons for dealing with data items, and it will essentially help you meet the terms of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, more commonly known as the GDPR. As you may already know, organisations should be looking to create data flow maps of all of their existing processes ahead of the GDPR compliance deadline. Now that we're past that, it's now a matter of maintaining those moving forward. And Cyber Comply is our online cybersecurity and compliance platform. There's two sides to it, which some of you may be aware of already. We have our compliance manager, which is an area where we store the entire EU GDPR regulation pieces. That's not part of today's presentation, but we will cover off some minor points of that, and it will also integrate a number of other tools, including the data flow mapping tool, which is for today's presentation. So in order to create an accurate data flow map of each of your processes, you'll need to know the following: what every step of the process is, who carries out each and every step, and what assets are used to do so. We would encourage organisations that are new to mapping processes to hold a number of workshops, maybe with senior management of those individual departments, to obviously gain a better understanding as to where the data is stored and to cover off each one of those three steps we've just gone through. So using the tool, just to cover off some of the selling points to it, it is essentially built to be easy to use. So you can introduce a new user within your organization and have them up and running relatively quickly on how to use the product. All of these webinars that we are doing are also recorded, they're uploaded, so you can also access them online if you wanted to refer back to them. And the point of the mapping tool as well is just to obviously mitigate the amount of time spent on identifying and resolving data protection issues as well. As I mentioned earlier, the point of the data mapping was to have it in place before the GDPR deadline, but now it's just a matter of maintaining those data process maps moving forward. And the data flow mapping tool is an ideal tool for that, as it is geared for repeatability. It allows you to clone certain processes if you find that you have a number of them that are very similar to each other. They can be easily reviewed, edited, and updated by multiple people as your organization evolves. That will come under the user management screen, which again, like I mentioned, we'll go into a bit more detail later on. You can log personal data items, so you can generate essentially an inventory of personal data items, specify what the lawful basis is, the types of personal data you're dealing with, and the categories of the data subjects. So that will all be covered when we go through the mapping process itself. The reports that this will be producing for you, they're version controlled data flow reports, compiling of information from your data flow map in an easy to read format to share with stakeholders or even external bodies should you be requested to provide that information further on down the line. One of the key words that we use is it does embed data protection by design. The tool is essential for organizations seeking to embed data protection by design and by default into the processes, and it is something that is encouraged by the GDPR, obviously given its nature of the regulation. It gives optional access to security controls, so like I touched on earlier, the compliance manager can be bundled with the data flow mapping tool, and it is encouraged. It's not mandatory, but essentially what it will give you is, again, access to the entire regulation pieces as well as some other localized legal regulations such as UK laws, etc. It's a way you can record what security controls have been applied to a process. So by security controls, it's not just regulation pieces. That could be if you're 27001 certified, for example, you could say that yes, we're using part of the annex in relation to this process to ensure that the data is kept secure at all times. So user management. How many users can you have? Now, as standard, the tool itself is going to be available for up to 5 users as standard. You can differentiate between different levels of access that they will have. So, for example, you could have 2 setters, organization administrators, 1 setters maybe a read-only, and then another 2 setters contributors. Contributors allow them to have access to the maps. They can contribute to those maps, obviously as the name implies, but it doesn't give them access to any of the user settings, etc. The next point would be easily archiving these users. So if you have 5 users as standard, you can always remove them as users of the product, which will then essentially free up more users to access the tool at any given point. Okay, so setup. So logging into CyberComply, it's as simple as launching a modern browser such as Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Edge, etc. We're then going to show you how to navigate to the data flow mapping tool. We're going to go through the homepage areas and then go through setting up a business process that you want to map. So creating a process, we're going to move over into the tool in just a moment. So in order to create processes, you'll need to switch yourselves into edit modes, and obviously this will all be covered off. So we're going to switch over into CyberComply now, which should now be visible on your screen. Once you've logged in, you'll then be greeted by the CyberComply welcome screen. This will give you access to the Compliance Manager and the Data Flow Mapping tool. The Compliance Manager, as I mentioned, is where the online repository for the regulation pieces are stored, and then you'll have the Data Flow Mapping tool on the right-hand side, which we're going to cover off this afternoon. We do embed a number of quick start guides to help new users get used to the tool, understand some of the more in-depth features of it, and each time the tool is updated, so are the manuals obviously to reflect any changes. Before we go any further, we're going to go through the user management and also the consultancy access, which is a new addition to the tool. And the way that we do that is by navigating to the top right-hand corner, where you'll have a drop-down menu where you can request assistance, and that'll come through to me and my team here in Vigilant Software. You can then have access to your user details, so that's you, the person who is logged in at that moment. So you can change things like your name, email address, etc. We then have the account summary, which is where you'll have access to changing people's level of access to the tool. You can modify how many users you have. They can be expanded upon over time if you need to. We then have our settings menu, which is where you input the additional information for your data protection officers, etc. And then obviously we have logout down the bottom here. So we're going to go into account summary to begin with, just to better explain this for people that are new to the tool and want to invite some of their colleagues to start working alongside them as well. So over here on the right hand side, you'll be able to see your purchases. So we can see here when the subscriptions are due to end, and obviously you then have the ability to purchase more if you need to. Touching on the user count, you can increase it in blocks of 5, and it is dependent on quotations. So contact us directly and we can generate a specific quote yourself depending on how much longer you have left on your subscription to include those additional users. Over here on the left-hand side, you will then have your users themselves. So mine are obviously all going to be myself. It's my portal and it's purely used for demonstration purposes. You'll see next to each one of these that you'll have different levels of access. So read only, it will purely allow the first user on the left hand side to log into the tool. They can view the maps, they can view the reports, but they can't publish the reports, they can't run them, they can't modify any of the maps, they can't change any of the information. It is, as implied, simply a read only access. And there's an unlimited count for these, so you can also invite senior management or stakeholders that aren't part of the process, the mapping process itself. But you could obviously just grant them access so they can see how your project is coming along. Below, I mentioned earlier, you have your contributor. This is normally reserved for if you're working with an external consultancy company. You may want to grant one of those consultants access on a temporary basis. You set them up as a contributor. They can modify maps, change processes, and any text on there, but they can't change anything within the area that we're currently working on. Finally, you have your organization administrator. That gives you essentially every right you can have within the system. You can modify your registered address. You can see up here on the top left, we can modify things like who has access, who is archived, and then finally down the bottom, you'll then have your profile itself. So just to explain in more detail the consultancy access, if we go into this account here, so this is one that I've just set up this afternoon, we can see that active sessions are limited here. So if I was a consultant, so if we flip this around and I'm currently accessing a client's account, we can see on my profile that I'm logged into this person's on this IP address, and then you've got a list of your accounts and it will give you an indicator as to which one you're currently accessing. You will essentially over time, if you are working as a consultant, you'll have a number of different access or company names on the left hand side, and it's up to the user of those tools or the owner of those portals to either revoke your access or modify your access level. They can also, as a consultant, so we'll flip back to that side again, you can remove the account from your system if either you're no longer working with the client or they no longer require you to have access to the mapping tool itself. Equally, you can then terminate all sessions because you can actually be logged into a number of different sessions at any given point. So obviously you'll have the terminate all option down here. So that should explain consultancy access in its basic format. Just to reiterate on that, it saves a consultant, for example, have a number of different email addresses just to access different people's accounts. They can just have one active profile, which can then be invited to a number of different customer portals if needed. So coming back to the account summary, just to recap, you've got your list of users on the left-hand side. They can be edited, you can change their status, and then to add new users, and this is quite a common question actually, you simply come into the account summary, select on add users, you'll be asked to enter in an email address, what level of access you'd like to give them. So again, if you're working with a consultancy firm, invite them via email, give them the contributor access, and then they'll have simply that access. You can revoke access on a temporary basis without removing the customer or the client, and then also set them up as an organization administrator if you have somebody else in your own business you want to have the same level of access as yourself. So we'll come out of here. I'm just going to navigate now back to the main dashboard, which will take us back to the data flow map icon. So we're going to select on here, and this will take us into the tool itself. Below there, you will have access to a PDF downloadable quick start guide, which will just give new users an introduction to the key areas within the data mapping tool itself. So up here on the top left-hand side, this is where we're going to be mainly focusing on for now. The areas we're going to cover off is asset management. We're going to show you how to import a pre-existing asset register. Now, albeit ours is very basic, it's just to give you the basics on what information you need to input into those. These can be accessed using the drop down. If you have the compliance manager and the data mapping tool as a bundle, you'll have access to each and every one of these areas underneath here. If you only have the mapping tool, you'll have access to organization assets, you'll have access to processes down the bottom, and also tasks, and we'll cover off that a little bit later on as well. So we're going to navigate now into our organization assets. We do have some pre-configured. We'll show you how it also then interacts and understands which processes the asset itself is being used within. We can show you how to add in things like controls you're using on an asset, what regulations it's maybe working with or needs to be compliant with, etc. So we're going to select on the top one here our distributor. We can already see that it's already been given its asset type, so the way we want it displayed not only from a top level but also within our reports, we're displaying it as a warehouse. We can show how many records have been stored on this particular asset, and that's something you build upon when you're inside the maps themselves. You'll have what they're operating as within your business, and then finally you'll have the location. So we've got this one in France, and that will come into a better explanation as we go through the maps themselves. The top right hand corner, you'll have the option to delete an asset. Now it won't let you do this if it's already been used in a map. You'll need to navigate to that map, remove it, and then you'll be able to remove it from the system. If you have modifications to be made to an asset, and this also goes for a lot of the other parts of the tool as well, you can edit the asset at any point. So selecting on here, you can go through, modify what the asset type is. So if we need to change it from warehouse to something else, we can do so. We can change its reference. So that's just simply what it's seen as or named as within the business. We've then got what it's operating as, so whether it's a third party, controller, processor, etc. And then finally the location as to where it's stored as well. So we'll cancel out of here. If you want to run a report on your assets, you can do so at this point here, and it will just give you a brief breakdown as to what we've covered off a second ago. So it will just give you an indication of which records are stored on there, which processes it's being used with, and then any additional information at the top here, such as asset type, record numbers, operator type, and location, and the number of comments stored on there. If we want to do that for a number of them, we can come down here on the left-hand side, select them in bulk, run the report, and it will include them all within the same report, and that way you've got the same data at the top here, just to keep a nice version control each time you run these individual reports. Now, one thing we are going to show you today is how to import from a pre-existing asset register. So if we select on import here, if you want to create a new one from scratch, you can download our Excel template, and it just gives you the headers in the correct order, and then you populate it with the information you want to. We're going to choose to upload a file, so asset import template test. We're going to select OK. It's going to reside here for now, and then we select import. It's a very quick process. Obviously this will depend on the amount of information you're storing in here, but it will confirm that the import has been completed. We can see down here that test asset has been added to our list, and up here we can see it's a mobile device, records 0, obviously we've just imported it, what it's operating as, and where it's located. Now, for people that are already using the data mapping tool, just to explain in more detail, essentially the information you need to enter into that Excel template is what you would see under these. So you'd need to mark whether it's local storage, whether it's a person, postbox, etc. The reference is essentially just what it's called. You then need to input under the operator tab, whether it's a processor, etc. But when it comes to location, you simply need to type in just the name of the country. So United Kingdom in this case, you don't need to state it's whether it's EEA, non-EEA, or whether there's been an EC adequacy decision made. The system will automatically pick that up for you. So that is the organization asset screen. So you've got the create new, just to recap here. You can import assets that we just covered off there, and then each one you select on the left hand side will populate the middle screen where you can either run reports, you can view additional information such as which controls are being used in conjunction with that asset, which regulation or legal requirements, if there's any assigned tasks. Again, we'll cover all this when we go through the process level itself. Any related processes, this is an auto-populating field once you start using this asset within certain areas. And then finally you'll have messages, which is an audit trail come message board where you can leave notes to each other. And then finally, if you want to make a relationship or show an association between two assets, you can do so on this screen as well. Along the top here, over time, your asset library is likely to become quite large. We've got quick search functions at the top. We've got pie charts to indicate or break down how much of our how many of our assets are seen as to be controllers, processors, or third parties. We have help and tip sections, again, just to help new users get to grips with how the tool is working, in particular, what area they're currently looking at. And then finally, you've got a select all button if you wanted to do so, and then run that report over here on the right-hand side. So that is organization assets. The next area we're going to come into now is going to be the organization processes. So whilst we're waiting for this to move onto that screen, organization processes, as some of you may have found, you can break down into process groups. Now, by process groups, that can be done purely on your own requirements. So it can either be, in our case, we've done it based on departments. We've broken down sales. You could then have human resources, or if you've got areas of the business you want to focus on, maybe a newsletter campaign, you may want to show the processes involved in that. And if you're a global entity, you may then want to break these down into the more localized areas if that's how you prefer to work. Again, at the top here, you've got that option to search for any of your pre-existing processes. You've got another pie chart breakdown here to let you know how many of your processes you're seen to be a controller of or a processor within. You've then got, again, those help sections, and finally you've got the select all button again at the top here as well. So to create a new process, you simply, or to start from scratch, you will select on create new. If you've already got existing groups available to you, they'll be available in the drop down. If not, you'll be asked to create a new group from scratch. Under here, you'll just need to enter in a name, subtitle, and description as to what's going to be encompassed within that group of processes. So we're just going to select on sales in our case, and when you select next, you'll then be asked to enter in all of the required information before you even start mapping the process out. So again, this is to reiterate why you need to hold those workshops before even starting to map the process within the tool itself. So at the starting point, you'll be asked to enter in the title of the process, who the process owner is, whether that's a sales manager or Jeff from sales. It's entirely up to you how you want that to be displayed. You can then mark what your business is operating as within this process, so whether you're a controller of the data within it, a joint controller, processor, or third party. You'll then be asked to enter in the controller's contact details, so whether that's your organization or not. So if we were to change this, that we are now actually acting as a controller, that field removes because that information would have already been input by yourself. You'll then be asked to enter in the scope statement for what's essentially what you're hoping to encompass again within the process, the purpose or actually having the process in place in the first place, and then you'll have an additional box at the bottom here to input technical and organizational security measures as well. So if we navigate to one that we've used previously in demonstrations, we have our software sales within the EEA. It's a very basic version of our organization. Some of you may have seen this before, but it's just to, again, cover off some of the key elements that you'll be looking to go through, but we will expand on what's typically covered within those demos as well. So once we've selected on our process, if we expand on here, this is the information that we would have entered in that stage that we just showed you. So we've got our scope statement at the top here, so transactions of sales within the EEA, the purpose, fulfillment of software products, and then finally technical and organizational security measures. In our case, it's just a placeholder really. We've just entered in PCI controls in place with taking payments. We as an organization, so in our case Vigilant Software, are simply a processor or acting as a processor within the process, and therefore we would have then had to enter in the controller's contact details. So we've used everyone's favorite person, John Smith, followed by his email address, phone number, and physical address as well. Below there, you'll then have the representative contact details. So that's the person within our organization that's going to be processing the information on behalf of John Smith's organization. If we minimize on here, we have additional drop downs here that we can start to populate. These aren't mandatory fields, you don't have to use them, but it is something that you may wish to beef up over time once you've mapped out the process and once you started to understand, okay, we actually use this control in place, or we're compliant with this regulation when doing this process. So the first one we're going to drop down onto are the related controls. We've got some placeholders here from Annex A 27001. Now, everything that's included within the data mapping tool is what I'm showing you today, and I will point out areas that aren't included and would require access to the compliance manager as well. If we select on the I button here, it will bring up a description as to what that control is. So we can see it's a set of policies for information security, etc. You'll have its reference as to where it falls within the control set. Its status is always going to be published, as it's information that we have personally uploaded and published to the site for you. And then if you have the compliance manager, we can either select open here and it takes you into that side of the portal where you get to see things like implementation guidance, requirements for regulation pieces, etc. And then finally you can mark whether that control is selected and implemented, selected and planned, etc. Again, that's compliance manager, that's not part of the mapping tool. If you want to add a control, you simply select Add Control. It will give you access to 27001, 2013, and also the control set that was before that, so 2005. You can access the I button again within here, so we can again see what the description is, its reference, and then finally your status. This section again is only for the Compliance Manager bundle owners as well. To add a control, you simply add the plus button, it will confirm, and now we've got the option to delete as opposed to add. We then select close, and then we can see it's been added onto this section as well. We move along now onto the related legal requirements. Again, not a mandatory area, but it might be a nice to have when you come to run reports from a process level, not just from the process map level. So at the moment we've got a placeholder here, which is Section 3 UK Laws, Selection and Prevention of Public Records. If we select the I button, you'll again have that description. This is all included in the mapping tool. This down the bottom here, whether you're compliant or non-compliant, that's all part of the Compliance Manager, as well as the open button to view implementation guidance and the original source documentation as well. To add the requirement, exactly the same as the control area. We select on Add Legal Requirement, and it will pull up UK laws to begin with, and then midway down we'll then come into the EU GDPR and all of the related recitals, articles and chapters, etc. The next tab along is related tasks. So as we mentioned earlier, you can have up to 5 users, 10, 15, depending on which package you purchase at the time. You may want to have the ability to leave a task to another user of the portal. The reason for that could maybe be I've created the process itself, I've input all the contact details, but I'm not actually going to be taking part in the processing or the mapping part of the process itself. I can then assign that to the designated person within the business. To do so, all you simply do is select Create Task, choose who the owner of that task is going to be. Now, obviously, naturally, there need to be someone who has access to the portal, so it gives you the drop down to all users. You've then got the deadline as to when that needs to be followed up, followed by your area where you can enter in what the task actually is, with additional content options at the top here, whether you want to break it down into numbers, bullet points, or even attach or hyperlink into the area as well. Once these have been worked on, we can select to either remove them, we can select on the I button if we want to, and we can mark whether it's been completed or not. The next tab along is an area where we can show relationships between individual processes. Now, again, this isn't an automated thing. The system won't automatically know which processes are related. And the purpose of this area is to say maybe, okay, sales will then have some form of relationship with either a support process. It could have a post-sales process linked to it, but they're not necessarily going to overlap within the same process map. To do so, all you simply do is select Add Process, and it will give you access to all of the other processes you'll have already created up to that point. The next one along is that message board come audit trail. So we looked at it very briefly a second ago under the asset menu. It will just give you an indication as to when things have been changed. So we can see here that I have edited the process information 3 minutes ago. We can see that we added a control 3 minutes ago as well. And then we can also see a day ago that we attached a process report, a process report was exported, and it gives you a direct link to re-download that at any point if you needed to. Not only does it keep a track of everything that's been changed, that will go for when it was changed and who's made the change. You'll also have an area where you can add comments. This is the free text area, a running theme with the comments within the tool. They are purely standalone. They do not show up on reports, so they can be used essentially just for quick chat between users of the portal. If you need to upload maybe an older diagram, maybe it's even as basic as post-it notes on a whiteboard, you can upload that so that the user has access to that information when they're then going through and mapping the process out within the tool itself. If we select on the A button at the top here, you've then got those same additional editing options as we saw earlier under the task section as well. The very last tab on here are the related assets. So this is going to give you a list of all of the used assets within this process map. When we go back into the organization assets screen, if you go to the related process tab, it will then essentially mirror what you can see here. So it will say that yes, if you go to the company sales website under the assets menu, select on related processes, that field will have automatically been populated with software sales within the EEA. If we select on the I button, it then just gives you a breakdown as to what we demonstrated earlier. At the top here, you've got that same report option. So if we select report now, it'll give you the process report. It will let you know the company or the organization, as in your organization. You'll have the issue date, so it's a key way of keeping version controls. And then you'll have a breakdown as to all the information we covered a second ago, such as the owner of the process, what we're acting as within the process, scope, purpose, etc. You'll then have a table breakdown to show you which controls you're using in relationship with that process, the clauses from either UK law or GDPR, related processes, any tasks, and then finally a list of the associated assets as well. This can be printed directly from the browser, or with most browsers nowadays, you can then have the option to export directly into a PDF as well. So we'll cancel out of here. Just to cover off these extra options over here on the right hand side, the geared for repeatability is essentially demonstrated solely here. So whilst we have a software sales within the EEA, you may have that process in place for organised companies outside of that jurisdiction. So instead of recreating the whole map again using all the same assets, you simply clone the process. It will ask you which group you want to assign it to. So obviously, if you've got it broken down into localized offices or different departments within the business, you can make that selection here, and then it will just create a carbon copy of it, but it will rename it as copy, so you can differentiate between the two, allowing you to then have access into editing the name if you see fit. If you need to edit the process at any point, we can select on here. It will take us back into this same area as giving you the option to obviously modify all this information as well. We'll cancel out of here. We can delete a process. Now, this is only available to organization administrators. Contributors can't do this. And if you just want to minimize it out of this main area and back into its process group, use the close button over here. So what we've covered so far, just to recap, we have gone through organization assets, how to import them via an Excel sheet and how to create them within the tool itself. We've then covered off the process creation, so how you'd set up a process group by going into creating a group or selecting a pre-existing one. We've then also shown you how you would create a process, including the contact details, etc. And now we're going to move on into the mapping process itself. Before we do that, there's one area that we need to cover off under this drop down, and that's the settings menu. Under here, this is where you're going to need to start inputting information such as the types of classifications. Now, this is going to relate directly to the records you're storing on particular assets. For example, if you're storing records on a server or anywhere else within your business, you need to identify whether they are seen as confidential, private, public, restricted. They're the four main options you'll have available when you first access the tool. And at the bottom here, we've got two additional ones that we've added on that are custom to our organization, such as sensitive or highly restrictive. We can toggle each one of these on and off at any given point. Now, obviously, if you do have a record that's already using that classification, it won't allow you to toggle it off. And if you no longer have that classification within the business, you can then delete it from the tool entirely. To add a classification, simply select on the button at the bottom here. It's a free text box. You can enter in here whatever you need to. And then we can decide to toggle it on straight away or toggle it off and just have it available to you at a later point if you needed to. The next tab along are custom regions. Now, custom regions are for use with asset creation, but also when you're working within the map itself. Now, the placeholders we have here are so if we want to stipulate exactly where we store our data online in Microsoft Azure, if we know, for example, it's going to be Ireland, we just simply create a custom region that will be available to you under locations. You give it its main area, so Ireland, EEA, and then you've got an option to rename it how you see fit. And then down the bottom here, the second example we have is especially for US customers, with the country being so large and you may have broadened office space across the entire country, you may want to specify exactly where in the country you're going to be holding that information. So if you want to break it down by city, state, etc. The very last section on here is where you're going to be adding in your contact details for process records. So the first one is going to be your contact details as a business, and you can mark that as whether that's used as your registered address as a contact address. You'll then be required to add in your data protection officer. Now this could be somebody internally within your business, or if you're a smaller organization, you may be outsourcing that particular role to another company, but you'll still need to have all that information put in here, and this will then show up on your end report as well. And then finally, you'll have your representative within your organization. Again, you'll need to add in things like the name, address, contact information such as email and phone number as well. Okay, we have a couple of questions. I will answer them where I can as we go through, but we would typically answer them towards the end. So we will go back into our process level, and then we'll start the process itself. Okay, so David Morgan, with regards to legal instruments included in the tool, at the moment it is simply UK laws. We've got a bit more information on that we can share with you after the meeting, and also the GDPR. And the second question from Laura Buckley was, what is the definition of confidential versus sensitive, please? Again, we can share that with you after the meeting. We'll give you the full breakdown as to how they're seen within the GDPR. They're more just placeholders that we use for the examples in these presentations. So the next step we're going to move on into is the data flow map itself. As like I mentioned, to keep us within the time constraints for these presentations, we have one that's been pre-created. It's one that some of you may have already seen if you've been on the pre-sales demonstration, but we're going to show you how we built it from scratch, the information that's kept within the process map itself, and then ultimately the report and how to manipulate it further along down the line if you need to. So this will be the screen that you'll be greeted with when you first open up a new process map. Now, when you first open one, you will simply have a data input which is blank, and it will be going into an asset known as other. To remove these assets, all you'd simply need to do is select on one of them and then select the remove button to then give you that blank canvas to start with. So to cover off these main four icons in the middle, these are what you're going to use to build, create, manipulate and comment on the map moving forward. The first one is the hand tool. As I just showed you, it allows you to select key areas of the map, so that can be at an asset level. So over here on the right hand side, it opens up an attributes panel where you can modify references, etc. We've then got the option to select the transfers between them. So what type of transfer is it? What items are being moved along there? Any comments? And if the data is encrypted at that stage. We've then got our hand tool. Excuse me. The move tool will allow you to manipulate the map like so. So if you're working on a basic map to begin with, but you know it's going to expand over time, instead of deconstructing the map to then rebuild from an earlier point, just simply manipulate it into a different order, so you then free up a bit of space to then create the connections between them. What you'll notice is the name of the asset will always clip over the line transfers, so that's never going to be obstructed at any point, and all of the data transfers, connections that you'd have already predefined will remain in place as well. Pop that back in. The connection tool essentially does what it says on the tin. You simply highlight over the first asset or first input you'd like to join, select on the orange icon or the little orange dot that you should be able to see next to the icon, click it once and then select on the area that you want to join it to, and then it will create these lines that you should be able to see on the screen. The connection points, you may see there's a slight difference between two of them. The first one is a dotted line. The dotted line simply indicates new data coming into a process. So these grey arrows at the beginning of our process are data inputs, so that's going to illustrate new data. And the grey solid lines with the number of items travelling along are the use of existing data items moving from one area of the business to another. The last area along here is our comment tool. Now, comments, again, like I mentioned, the running theme is they are available for internal use, but they don't show up on reports, simply in the fact of they will reference that there is a comment, but not necessarily what the comment is. So we can see here on distributor, there's already a comment in place. We select on here a bit of jargon, but essentially it's just an area where you can leave free text, and it also gives you the option to upload information as well. To add a comment, you can add more than one comment to an individual piece of the map, be that an asset or a connection, or a transfer between assets as well. So we'll come out of this screen. The next 6 icons at the top left hand corner, this is an area where you can just zoom in and out depending on how large or how small the map is. We've got the ability to remove and duplicate. So to activate those icons, simply select the hand tool, the area that you wish to remove or duplicate then becomes available to you. And then the next two on here are the undo and redo buttons, just to help mitigate some of those smaller mistakes you might make as you're going through the process creation itself. So we move on to the asset library. Now, as we showed you earlier, we already have one in place. We've created it from scratch, doing these demos over time, and this will be where you can access either ones that you have previously created before mapping, or it's actually an area where you can create an asset from scratch and then it will be stored in the library moving forward. So the very first option we have up here is to add a new asset. If we select once on here, it will open up another panel. We then choose the asset type, so whether it's seen as an archive within the business, local storage, mobile device, etc. If we select on our, let's say, call center icon, it populates the map straight away on the right hand side with a single click, or you can drag and drop this to a more specific area if you choose to. Once it's on the main page, using the hand tool, you make the selection, and then you can go through, modify if the asset changes over time. We're going to leave it as a call center. If you want to go through and modify its name or its reference within the business, so you could say call center US, for example. You can state whether you've got records, and we'll cover this in a bit more detail later on. You can then specify what it's going to be operating as, third-party processor, etc. Its location, whether it's UK, Andorra, US, etc. And then obviously it will carry across the status as well. Any comments you wish to add, and then if the data on there is going to be encrypted as well. So if we cancel out of here, we're going to select it again, and we're just going to actually choose to remove it, as we don't need to keep it within our library. If you choose to keep it and select save, it will then be stored over here for future use in the next couple of maps that you may need to have it available to you in. The next one is the option to then start showing data inputs. You're not limited to one data input per map. You can have as many as you need. The prime example for that is you may have a front desk within a business. It's going to have a number of different inputs, be that via email, it could be via post, it could be face-to-face interaction, etc. And each one you'll need to specify as a new data input. Even though it could be the same data coming in, you need to illustrate which type of method is being used to transfer it from one place to another. So if you select it on the add data input, creates a blank area, select on this area. Once you've made that connection, you can then outline what data items are being used, and you can name that data input. As you can see, we have here, such as customer along each one of them. So if we select on here, and again, just remove that. The last one at the top here is the ability to add a data subject. Now the data subject can be used in two ways here. One of them is if we want to be very specific on who the customer is, where they're going to be located. So if we use the example we already have on the map, we select the data subject, we can see that it's seen as a customer. You can rename it how you see fit. You've then got their location. So we're actually being specific in saying that this process is very specific based on our Spanish clients. And finally, any comments, and then you can show that being transferred throughout the rest of the process map. And again, we'll show you how that works in a second. The top here, the next option down, is the ability to search your asset library. Again, if they become quite large, they can become quite unruly, so we'll just put a quick search option to help you navigate your way through that. And then finally, in the grey area, you'll have the assets being used in the map, and then at the bottom here in the darker area, you'll then just have the rest of your existing library available to you should you need it at any point. To get these from the left-hand side attributes panel onto the map, again, we can simply click them once, it moves it onto the map. Or if you want to put it more specifically somewhere, you could say, okay, well, we need Marketing CRM UK right up here next to our distributor for whatever reason, but that option is available to you. If we select on these, we can just remove them. It doesn't delete them from the map itself or our asset library. It doesn't remove it from the asset library, just from the map itself. So we just remove them for now. So that's the asset library area on the left-hand side. What we're going to go through now is the build-up and the makeup of what our process is. So just to give you a top-level explanation as to what our process is trying to show you, it's going to be illustrating information that we're gaining from our customers in Spain. That then goes to our company sales website, so we've got that illustrated as a web application. How that data is then transferred to our billing team. The billing team processes our payments. It then goes into a service center inbox. In this case, it's an automated area. It will automatically back up all of the items onto our company server. The Some of the data items will be put onto an internal SharePoint that we may use for marketing and further on down the line. We then have the sales fulfillment team who are essentially going to be fulfilling that order and then sent out to a distributor who will then send it on to the end user, which could then ultimately be the follow-on process, and therefore you could make use of that related process area we looked at earlier. So just to go through the first beginning stages. So these are the data inputs coming into our process to begin with. At the top here, you choose data subject, or you can select other. If you choose other, the other data source could be maybe you're pulling information from an external server source or an external organization. You can then outline exactly who or what that is. We've then got its reference, so how you see that is within the business. We're keeping it nice and easy and leaving it as a customer. You've then got the method in which that information is coming to you from. So in our case, it's going to be the internet coming through our company sales portal. And obviously you've got an extensive list at the top here, such as download, face-to-face, instant messages, etc. But again, if this list isn't comprehensive enough, you've got the option to select other and then input your own other method if you choose to. We'll leave this as internet. You've then got the option where you can start showing the data items you're taking from these customers. At the top here, you'll have the area where you'll need to input the lawful basis, so be that consent, contractual necessity, vital interests. If you've got new users that are new to GDPR and also the tool itself, selecting the I button next to here will then give you a breakdown on the Article 6.1 as to what each one constitutes as. Below there, you'll then have exceptions. Now, exceptions are grayed out as standard. It's to prevent them being selected by mistake, and this will only become available to you when you're dealing with sensitive data items such as biometric data, etc. And then finally, on the left-hand side, you'll have your data items broken down into personal, so that will be things like the address, age, bank details, etc. Down the bottom here, you've got a selection for other. So if you want to outline here maybe something that isn't in the list, you can stipulate that at that point. So age under 13 tick box. And then finally, you've got your sensitive data items. So if we selected biometric data, exceptions then available, and then you can input here whether it's employment law, charity or not-for-profit bodies, etc. We're going to deselect on this, and then over here on the right hand side you'll have your data subjects themselves. So in our case it's a customer. We've got things like consultants, contractors, landlords, offenders, etc. And then finally at the bottom, other can be utilized again to put in something a little bit more specific to your organization if you needed to. So we'll cancel out of here. Below there, you've then got the comment section again. We can mark whether the data coming through this point is encrypted. We're going to stipulate that yes, it is, and the encryption details are HTTPS. But again, this is a custom area that you can modify based on your own requirements or your own types of level of encryption. So we select OK on here. What that would have done is it would have changed this from being a blank grey arrow to being the grey arrow now named as customer. We can then see the number of data items transferred along, and then that goes into our data subjects, which then continues on through the rest of the map itself. We look at this next one. This is actually essentially exactly the same information, except the data items may be different in each one of these, so address, age, bank details, etc. Lawful basis. Now, just to make you aware, when it comes to the report, we have chosen different lawful bases, just to show you how that then shows up on the reports towards the end. So that is the data inputs. What we're going to show you now is how the data subject is then going to transfer that data into us. So it's going to be a method is still via internet. And at this point, the right-hand side attributes panel is going to be ever so slightly different. So instead of selecting the data items you're going to be taking, you can now only select ones that you have available to you from that subject. So we're going to choose that each and every one of these needs to be passed through our company sales website and then subsequently through the rest of the process map itself. Select OK on here, and again you'll have the option for whether the data is encrypted, yes or no, and if there's any comments you wish to add as well. So we'll select apply on here. So these next ones, again we've just gone through each one of these. We've selected the types of transfer, so we're just going to say in this case it's a system-to-system transfer. And yes, all of these same 9 data items need to carry on through the process map. So that's going to go through the billing team, and then it's going to end up at our service center inbox. Now this one here, we're only choosing to send 2 of the data items. Now that's purely because we don't need to keep banking details, things like that on a SharePoint system. In our case, our SharePoint system is going to be used purely for a marketing repository database, so we don't need bank details, we don't need a lot of the information we would have taken at the very beginning. So we've chosen that the method is going to be a private network. The data items we're going to be sending through isn't necessarily going to be PayPal, things like that. It's going to be things like names, etc. We can only choose based on what we've chosen at the very beginning of the map. So we cancel out of here and cancel, and we can see here that will just show those 2 items moving forward. Now, just to explain the locations of each one of our assets, at the very beginning of this process, our service center, billing team, and company sales website, they're all based in the UK. Our sales fulfillment team and our distributor, they are based in France. So it will show you up on the report that there are cross-border processing, so whether it's going within EEA. And then more importantly, our company server is based, I believe, in the Bahamas. And the reason why we've done that is it then prompts further safeguards need to be input, etc. So if we look here, so our service center is going to be backing all of this information up to our company server. The company server, if we open up the attributes panel, will show that yes, it is in the Bahamas, and therefore it's a non-EEA state, and there's been no EC adequacy decision made. Therefore, the transfer at this point, we're showing that the method is a backup. The data items is all of them, comments, etc. We can still at this point mark yes if the encryption changes depending on type of transfer. But more importantly, we then have transfers to a third country. If we leave this as unknown, which is what it will do as standard, and it's then up to you to input the information, you'll get a very quick indicator that you do need to populate this area with further safeguards or derogations, etc. So selecting on here, you then choose maybe appropriate safeguards are in place. You'll then have additional drop-down context areas where you can mark standard data protection clauses, binding corporate rules, etc., etc. Once we're happy with all of this and select OK, it reverts us back to the standard grey line with just the number of data items, and therefore there's no further cause of concern. So just to recap what we've shown you how to add new data inputs. We've shown you how those connections are made, how you then populate those connections with the type of data items. We've then shown you how they transfer through each one of these assets. Now what we're going to show you is how we can modify each one of the assets within the map, and then obviously how that has a subsequent effect on the rest of the report, and also your organization asset library. We're also going to show you the records as well. So the key one that we use for this is going to be our company server. At this stage, we may wish to modify this, so we've got it shown as a local storage. Obviously that's not too accurate. We may wish to change it to our server. We can then modify what its reference is going to be, so we could say backup location. So we'll just modify that now. We can then stipulate if there are records being stored, and we'll come back to that in a second. We can then outline what the asset is, whether it's a processor of our data, a controller, third party, etc. We can then modify its location, and we can do this at any point. However, it will then have an impact on that stored asset. So if you are making a change here, it's going to have a change globally across the rest of your process maps that asset is being used in. What you'll also note in here is the system will automatically pick up your more commonly used locations. So again, it's just to help speed up the process of the mapping exercise in general. And you'll also have access to your custom locations. So that Microsoft Azure Ireland location is going to be located right at the top, as that's where our internal SharePoint system is based. So we're going to leave it as the Bahamas, otherwise it will take off our safeguards. And then finally down the bottom here, you've got on an asset level how it stores its data. So we're going to say the data, yes, is encrypted on our backup location. It's going to be via something like BitLocker or equivalent. Once we're happy with all of this, we can then start outlining what records are stored on here. Now, we've only got one. There is no limit to the number of records that can be stored on an asset, but once a record has been created, it cannot be removed. It can only simply be edited on further on down the line. So we're going to select on edit record, as this gives us the same context areas that you'd be required to populate if you're choosing to add a new record. We just purely use to edit as opposed to creating multiples of the same thing during these training webinars. So at the top here, you've got the name of the record itself. So ours is going to be online sales transactions data. We've then got its classification. Now, obviously the 4 that you'll have access to at the beginning is going to be confidential, private, public, and restricted. And then finally at the bottom, we've just added in some custom placeholders for sensitive and highly restrictive. Below there, you'll then have to stipulate the format in which the record is being stored in. So if it's a filing cabinet, for example, it's just simply going to be physical text, physical imagery, videos, audios, etc. You've then got the digital counterparts to those, and then you've got things like spreadsheets, PDFs, etc. as well. Below there, you've got your retention period, so that's how long you intend on retaining that information before it's no longer required or is no longer of use to your business, or how long you're stating to your customers you are indeed going to be storing their data for. Now, as an example, we tend to leave this as unknown, but obviously you've got the normal options for days, weeks, months, and years. And once you choose one of these, you can then input that exact period over on the left-hand side. We're going to leave it as unknown, and the reason for that is when you look at the report, it then identifies that you do have undefined retention periods on some of your records, and obviously that will then bring up a cause of concern when you view the report. That is something you'll need to go back and address further on down the line. The last point on here is going to be the recipients of that information. Now, in our case, we're leaving it as just simply the IT manager. That's purely because they're going to be essentially the main admin on something like a server. They're going to be able to interact with this data if they needed to, but you could end up putting things on here like sales manager, sales team, etc. It's a free text box and there's no limit to the number of recipients you can add on here either. Once you're happy with all of that, you select OK. And once we're happy with all of these changes we've made, all of the records we've created, hit apply. What you'll see is the icon has now modified itself to indicate it's now a server. The name of it's now been modified. And if we look over here on the asset library, you'll see that the backup location, formerly known as the company server, I believe it was, has now been modified. So now when you come to create a new process map, that new asset type will be available to you based on modifications you've made in an earlier process. So that is map creation at its core, essentially. Your processes, just to make you aware, we've seen some that are as small as 3 to 4 individual assets, purely depending on that individual process you're choosing to map out. We've also seen other organizations that have maybe up to 25 different inputs. You'll then have up to 15, 20 different assets to handle them, and then obviously a number of different connections between those as well. And we do have more in-depth ones that we can share with you just to give you a scale of how large maps can be built within the mapping tool itself. So once we're happy with the map we've made, all of the asset modifications we've done, the data items and the methods of transfer, we can then move on to what this is ultimately going to be able to produce for you. So the first one is the view report. Now the view the report option is something that we would maybe recommend using once or twice when you're creating the map. What it will do is it will just give you a quick indicator as to what the report is going to look like towards the end. This doesn't require you to save the map, it doesn't require you to refresh the page or anything like that. It automatically pulls information based on what you're creating at that exact time. From here, you can choose to print the report as it stands, or you can export it into PDF to keep an electronic copy of it as opposed to printing. But there's also an option to export this map or this process report different to the asset report and also the process level report. This can be exported into a Word document should you need to make fine-tuned tweaks to it, obviously better suit your requirements. If maybe you have your own internal reference in numbers, putting it into Word gives you that flexibility to do that. So just to go through the process report as it stands. At the top here, you'll have the reason for the map in itself. You'll then have the contact details, so John Smith acts as a processor for the process described in this report. You'll then have the process, so the name and contact details, so the name of my organization, the controller of the information, and then finally the representative. You'll then have the process overview, so the name of the process, owner, scope statement, purpose of processing, and any technical and organizational security measures. You'll then have a top-level summary of the report of the map itself. So you're going to see here that it takes legitimate interest as a lawful basis for 4 of the items. It takes contractual necessity for the other 4, and then it will take consent as one of the data items. So again, like I mentioned earlier, it's not overly accurate. It's just to show you how the report will display that when you come to run it towards the end of the mapping process. It will also pick up if it does entail any processing of sensitive data items, if it does include cross-border processing, which ours does, it goes from the UK to not only Ireland but France, and also that it does include transfers to outside the EEA, so that's our UK service centre going over to the Bahamas backup centre. The next area is section 1.2, and this is just going to be a snapshot of the map itself. Now, the maps do scale relatively well, but essentially these are designed for A4 PDF printouts. If the map does become quite large, pop it into a Word document, copy the image file and put it onto its own page if that helps distribute the size of the map. Alternatively, it can be removed and it can be linked to directly using the link above at a later stage if you wanted to. The next section down here is section 1.3, your personal data inventory. So again, it's just going to give you that summary of the lawful basis for each of the data items. We can see the data items over here on the left-hand column. The middle column, who is the data subject, the lawful basis for us taking that information, and then finally the exception. But again, exception is going to remain as not applicable in this case, as we're not dealing with sensitive data items. The next point down is going to be our list of data subjects. So we only have one in our process, and that's our customer based in Spain. We then have our asset register. So this is going to break down each and every one of these assets that we're using. So the far left column, we have the name and asset type. You'll then have its location along with its jurisdiction status, whether it's EEA, non-EEA, or whether there's been an EC adequacy decision made on that location. You'll then have its operator type, followed by if there's any encryption on that particular asset, any records that are stored, so we only have one, which is the online sales transactions, and then finally that comments section over here on the right-hand side. Like I mentioned earlier, comments are not displayed, they're purely for internal use only, but the report will make reference that there is actually a comment that resides on that asset, transfer, etc. What we find some organizations might wish to do is by exporting this into a Word document, it then allows them to remove this column, as some companies don't see it to be useful when it comes to the end report anyway. The next area that you'll move on to is 1.6 records. So on here, you will have all records have an undefined retention period. And that's purely because we only have one. And as we mentioned earlier, we stipulated that we have it's unknown as to how long we retain that information for. It will then give you a breakdown as to the classifications of the records. So if we had maybe 5 records, one of them was sensitive, restricted, public, etc., it will give you a breakdown in the summary, and then the table will then outline that in a bit more detail over here. So you'll have your name, online sales transactions, classifications is sensitive, the format, retention period, and then finally the recipients of that information as well. And then the very final section, 1.7 transfers. This is then just going to give you that full table breakdown. The scaling of this will then correct itself when it's exported correctly. This is purely just as it is when you're trying to view it within inside the data mapping tool itself. And what this will break down in a table format is the method. So how is it being moved from one place to another? The data source, so not applicable, but I believe if we go further down, we've got data subject on one of them, and that's where our information originally starts. You'll then have the data items, so what we're actually handling, what part of the organization or asset they're coming from and to, if there's encryption on that level, any third country transfer information, so that backup is going to stipulate safeguards are in place. And then lastly, again, we have that comments column, which again you may wish to leave in place, or alternatively you can then choose to remove the entire column if you needed to as well. So that is the end report and subsequently the end of today's presentation. We do have around 15 minutes left, which will make the best time of answering any questions you might have. If there's something that I can't answer during the presentation, we'll endeavour to come back to you afterwards if it's something a bit more in depth related to the GDPR, not necessarily the tool itself. So thank you very much for your time today. If you do have any questions, we do encourage you pop them into the chat area that you should have access to within the GoToWebinar function. To make you all aware that these meetings are recorded in their entirety, that will include the beginning stages that we covered in those slides, and then ultimately the essentially the use of the tool itself. So what we're going to finalize on now are we're just going to cover off some of the last points on our slides. So we've gone through the creation of a process. We've then gone through the final outcome, which is ultimately that report. And we're now going to move on into Q&A. And we'll just leave this on screen as a placeholder. So again, thank you very much for your time, and please pop any